Hi, I'm Mara Webster with In Creative Company, and thank you so much for tuning into one of our talks today. We are a year-round talk series bringing you the best creative voices across film, television, theater, and entertainment. And today we're really fortunate to be joined by the team behind the documentary WeWork, or the making and breaking of a $47 billion unicorn. We have Jed Rothstein, who's the director, and Ross Dinerstein, who is the producer of the film. And I wanted to begin by talking a little bit about the subjects that you pulled into the documentary, because as well as having journalists who covered the rise and fall of the company as we now know it, you also have a lot of former employees who worked there and worked very closely with Adam. And
Yes.
when you first reached out and connected with them, were people immediately very open to having conversations with you on camera, or were there any people who were a little bit reticent and had questions about how you were going to be framing this story before agreeing to participate?
Uh, you know, I would say that people were reticent. They wanted to understand how we were going to tell the story. Some of them had personal concerns about their, agreements they might have made with the company, or even just a feeling of not wanting to speak out of school. And so I think we had to assure people that our intentions were just to tell the story as in their words, not to sort of um, craft it from what we thought it was, but to learn what it was by them telling us. And many people responded to that. A few people still felt like they couldn't talk, but I think we had a lot of luck with people who wanted to talk about their experiences because they felt like their experiences were very important and meaningful to them, even if sometimes they didn't end well. They felt like it was a really important movement in their life, and that there are things about that experience that, even though the version of the company under Adam kind of crashed and burned, that there are things about it that they want to pull forward into the world, and they wanted to share that story.
Yeah. And then Ross, maybe this is a question a little bit more directly for you, because Forbes Entertainment are also a partner on the movie. And so I was really interested in what they were able to bring to the table, and particularly because they were one of the companies that were covering and reporting on this story so much at the time. So there would have been a lot of information, I imagine, that they were able to bring forth into the story for you.
Yeah, I mean, Forbes was a great partner for many reasons, but mainly, they gave us credibility. Forbes is such a great brand, and they're known for unbiased journalism. And they also had, years and years of coverage and research of Adam Neumann and WeWork, from when it was starting out to when it hit its peak and to when it hit its, bottom. So it was really helpful to have them. Plus, as producers, there's a ton of research and development that goes on. And by having them as our partner, we were way ahead of the game and allowed us to get the project sort of out and made quicker because of their involvement.
Yeah.
Definitely.
And for both of you, the story obviously is telling what happened with the company of WeWork, but you go back a little bit further into, what were some of Adam's first impressions of the States, and the fact that he grew up watching movies like Animal House, and how that likely impacted certain things that he wanted to bring into the company, and what some of his initial business endeavors were before this. And so I was really interested in looking at his backstory prior to WeWork, how you really determined what those details were that were really important and were going to give us a lot more contextualization for what this company then became.
You know, for me, going into the story before I even knew very much about Adam or how the company would work, I understood that he had to move around a lot. And, knowing people growing up who had that experience, I found that a lot of them either became very introverted, or they were opposite. Became great salesmen. And Adam clearly became this guy who could enter any room and, in a very short period of time, have everybody paying a lot of attention to him because he was charismatic and well spoken and funny. And I think that was sort of the magic that built that company, and it fed back into his desire, I think, or what seemed to be his desire. I can't get inside his head, but what seemed to be his desire to create this community around him, and his success at getting a lot of people to follow it. So I think his experience growing up, like all of us, I think it clearly shaped him, and it shaped the way that company became sort of an externalized version of what he was doing with himself.
And there's also mention about how part of his childhood was spent in a commune style community at one point. And once you have that contextualization, it's really fascinating to see how many of the details he was building into the company. So how did you take that detail from his childhood and really use that to frame a lot of those community aspects that he was constantly pushing within WeWork?
Well, Adam's summation of his childhood spent partly in kibbutzes was that they were this great social experiment that kind of didn't work. And he wanted to build what he called a capitalist kibbutz, which is a bit of an oxymoron because a kibbutz traditionally is about a sort of socialist ideal. And I think that conflict, in a way, was at the center of him, and it was at the center of WeWork, and it was at the center of our story, the me versus the we. It was this desire to build a community, everyone kind of helping each other, everyone there for each other, except you eat what you kill and you take as much as you can. And I think what you see in the end when after they flew so high and became valued at $47 billion, when things started to go bad, Adam got a lot of money and a lot of people got, laid off. And so I think there was always this battle between the me and the we. And for a while, that tension was probably creative and helpful. And when things started, when the, what's it called when you dance around the chairs, removable chairs dance started to happen.
Musical chairs.
Musical chairs, right. When musical chairs started to be played and the little money got taken away each time, the we or the me really won out. And that was sort of the demise of Adam's version of that company and of that dream that he had for it.
It was always fascinating to me because I actually really respected sort of the core principles of WeWork. But as we got into it, and there's some key interviews in our doc where they talk about how Adam, preached a lot, but those rules didn't apply to him. And,
Right.
Specifically about his office, he had this big single office that was just for him, yet he was encouraging everyone to be in these shared spaces and be cramped to sort of create this environment of shared creativity. But yet he was completely isolated from everybody except for his inner circle. So that sort of level of hypocrisy, I also think, was a reason for, his ultimate downfall, or the company's ultimate downfall.
Yeah.
There's also that really interesting question that is kind of not leveled at a really gravitational degree, but like lightly raised a little bit a couple of times, such as the lawyer recounting a story where an usher at an event was like, is this some kind of cult, after seeing one of the presentations? And when you look at a lot of the ways that cults do function and the way that they draw people in, there's things like very specific phrasing and language mirroring. And WeWork very much used a lot of those similar tactics, which is fascinating. And so how much did you want to go down that road of questioning within the film and looking at some of those parallels?
I think you're right that they used some of tactics that mirrored that, and there were certainly elements of the groupthink that echoed cult-like behavior. And I think it was, and some of it was dark and I think, difficult for people after they look back on it, and some of it was kind of funny and fun. And I think it was interesting to weave through those elements of the story, the chanting, the T-shirts, everyone kind of thinking and acting in the same way. But at the same time, we didn't want to overplay it because nobody had to carve Adam's initials into their pelvis or, submit themselves to coercive, sex cult type things. So we wanted to, I think it was an element of the story that was interesting and important, and it definitely helped drive a lot of enthusiasm that people had for it. So it was important, but we didn't want to oversell what we really felt was going on once we learned about it.
And to sort of second that, I was making Heaven's Gate, a 4-part doc series about that cult at the exact same time as making WeWork. And yes, there's some similarities, but I think the biggest one that I took away was this idea of sort of isolating yourself with non-WeWork members. The whole idea of we live, and I think he was sort of beginning to follow some sort of strategies that were used and utilized by cults, intentionally or not. But there were definitely things that they were doing. It's like, it's our way, and you shouldn't really hang out with people that don't do things in the same way we do. And that was something that I really took away from this.
Yeah.
I just watched Heaven's Gate a couple of weeks ago, and that was what started to make me notice some of those parallels.
Yeah.
So that's so funny.
Yeah, there's
And,
something, maybe there's something wrong with me, but yeah.
I loved Heaven's Gate. I watched it while we were making this, and I remember calling Ross after one, not to give anything away, but when I saw, oh, these guys were like castrating themselves, we should we should be careful, because I don't think they did that at WeWork. So let's just be clear.
There's also huge complexity to who Adam was for people that he worked with. You know, like you said before, he had this great charisma. He became a great salesman. And so much of what he achieved was people going, oh, well, I'm not sure about this detail, but he's so great that I want to be part of this and I want to work with him. And he was a huge part of that selling point. And then as you get into the film further, we learn that there were kind of like nefarious moments at play, like his former assistant who, still seems very tied to him to a degree in certain ways, but at the same time, was like, he would turn around and threaten to fire people, and he was playing a lot of mind games. And I realized that once I was working less closely with him. And so at what point in even the journey of research and development before you were making the film, did you start to realize that behind the charisma and that connectivity that he really pulled people in with, there were other things at play as well?
Ross, did you realize that earlier in the process?
No, I mean, to be honest with you, I thought as we'd get into it that he would have been more of a criminal, and he wasn't a criminal. And I think when we were first starting this project, I was just sort of waiting for indictments and sort of like significant legal issues. And, fast forward 14 months from when we started, there's been none. And so that's something that was sort of interesting for me, is that everything he did was legal. He didn't break any laws. He's never really been accused of breaking any laws. And I would argue, at least for me personally, I definitely went into this doc thinking that we would find, or things would come to light that showed that. And so I give him credit for, playing by the rules. It's a different set of rules than other people play with. But I also think when you watch the doc, and if you really think about it, he was enabled. At the end of the day, people were throwing money at him. People were telling him he's the second coming. People are telling him he's the smartest guy in the world. And I think it did throw some gasoline on an existing fire. But there was a board that he had to report to. There was people that were signing off on these decisions. No one told Masa that he had to give all this money. And, Masa had a very specific business plan for his fund, which was focused on artificial intelligence. There's no artificial intelligence involved in renting desks. So again, it was this perfect storm of the media creating this monster, him leaning into it, his wife being his sort of number one fan, this money that was coming in, all of that. And there were decisions, forks in the road that he made that probably weren't things that I would do, but I don't know. It's a lot of money, and it's a lot of people in his ear telling him that he's a genius.
Yeah.
And sophisticated people. I mean, that's important to remember. People. His board, his investors, these were the creme de la creme of Wall Street and Silicon Valley. I mean, these were not people who had been hoodwinked or something. These were people, I think they wanted to believe it. I think in some ways, Adam is the tail end of this wave or maybe he's not the end, but he was an important inflection point in this wave of extreme deference to charismatic founders. Because it used to be that an inventor or a visionary entrepreneur would start a company, and as soon as they got to a certain level of investment, the guys with suits would come in and kind of take over and say, we know how to run things. And then after Steve Jobs came back to Apple and Zuckerberg and the various Elon Musk and a number of these founders really proved that, these kind of visionary guys can stay in control and make a lot of money for everybody. They began to get more and more deference. And I think with Adam, it showed that, he did have good ideas. He wasn't quite as good at, running and managing this thing. And I think that maybe that's a change in the business world that'll come out of this. Will be that founders, that extreme deference to founders, people will sort of think twice about that.
Yeah, and I've always been fascinated by this idea of like speculative valuation. These companies that are operating at significant losses but have really high values. I think since WeWork and Uber and Lyft and some other sort of potential IPOs that have tried to launch or did launch and fail, WeWork being one of them, I think people are starting to look at it. I mean, there's a couple key sound bites in our doc where Adam says, we choose when we want to be profitable. And he's talking, and they sort of redefine the definition of EBITDA, earnings before interest, taxes, deduction, and amortization. you can't really redefine an accounting principle. And that's what people, again, no one stopped them. I mean, this idea that they were valued at 47 billion, but we're losing, $1 million a day or whatever the number was. It doesn't really add up if you talk to someone that is not in the sort of finance world.
There's also that really fascinating conversation within the film about the fact that WeWork was really being sold as a technology company, but what it actually was a real estate company. Like you said before, it was renting desks and renting office spaces to people, but they completely marketed themselves as something different.
For the valuation. Adam would correct anyone that said, "Oh, this is a real estate company."
We're a tech company.
We're not. Yeah. We're a tech company, because the way real estate companies valued and the way a tech company is valued is different.
Yeah. Because it costs money to lease desks and office space and staff them and keep them clean and heated and lit and all the things you have to do. So your margins are just going to be lower than if you come up with the killer app or the piece of technology where once you hit a certain scale, each additional widget is almost, has a very marginal cost. That's the basic principle of these tech companies making gazillions of bucks. And I think that once you get more into the real world of physical things that cost money, it's not that these companies can't be successful on some metric, but they can't be successful on this 10 to 1, 10x ratio that multiple that people hope for with these tech companies.
It's like, a 10 times multiple on a negative number is a negative number. And for whatever reason, people forget that.
Yeah. Right.
And you really take that idea of like him building WeWork, and then you bring us into like the further business models that he was then creating off the back of it. We have We Live, where people were living in these dorm style spaces, and and then he moved towards starting an elementary school. And did you always kind of envision that like part of the structure of the film was like, here's the foundation of what he built, and then kind of like gradually introducing these offshoots, and how the genesis of WeWork really led into the creation of those and what those were specifically, and how overall it really became about just for people buying into the brand as a whole for their entire lifestyle by the end of it.
Yeah. And that, that was to me one of the most poignant moments. Ross referenced it earlier, but one of the characters lives in a We Live. And he talks about after some months, nobody would go out. And it was really, his friends from outside, meaning the rest of New York City, would occasionally come to visit, and only come once because they would visit and they'd be like, whoa, what is this? And I think that totalization, that physicalization of the idea was part of their vision. I mean, one of my favorite lines in the film is Rebecca referring to the collective we that we're all living under, and how, she started this We Grow program for kids, but they're going to start piling it on grownups. And when she says that, that's when I begin to think, whoa, what does that mean? You're piloting it on grownups. They never did. But I think that it's really when you begin to think that you can reinvent all of these different areas of life, as Randall Lane, one of our interviewees, says, you really start to wonder what the decision tree is, when it seems like everything could be put through the prism of your business vision, and why shouldn't the entire world be put through that? That's when you need to ask some questions.
Yeah.
I remember. Oh, sorry.
No, you go.
I was just gonna say, one of my favorite lines about the We Live thing is the interview subject goes, someone would say, oh, so-and-so's having their birthday. And the question was, what floor do they live on? Because it wasn't like what part of town they're in, but they became so isolated and encapsulated within this like We Live thing. It was never even about like, oh, are they on the Upper East Side? Are they in Brooklyn? It's like, oh, they're on the 3rd floor, or they're on the 5th floor.
Right.
And because you were mentioning his wife, Rebecca, as well, you really bring her into the story and look at the influence that she had and how she became much more involved in the company over time as well. So how did you really want to explore her as a character in the film and look at the impact that she had and some of the choices that she helped make for the business as well?
I mean, it was clear through Adam's life and his character and people that knew him that he was, when he came to New York, he was kind of this great classic New York hustler. He was trying out different things and trying to make one of them stick. And it's kind of a great tradition in New York and in America. And when he met Rebecca, I think she really did turn him on to understanding more about himself and to trying to link up what he thought was true about himself with the vision that he pursued. And so I think in some ways he owes her a lot. Probably in many ways, he would say he owes her a lot. But her, goopy vision, for lack of a better word, it became unchecked. To me, it was, she helped him find himself, and together they sort of found each other, but didn't have enough people telling them anything about boundaries or when they were going too far. And there's a story in the film about the whole company reorienting the definition of a cappuccino and a latte because Adam had them mixed up. And it's really kind of indicative of the moral of the story for me, which is surround yourself with people who will tell you no, or who will tell you that that's not a good idea, or maybe we shouldn't do that. When
It's
everybody
not a cappuccino, that's a latte.
Yeah, that's not a cappuccino, that's a latte, exactly. When everybody just tells you that everything you come up with is great, I think that's when you begin to veer off, as they did.
And there's a real turning point in the story too. Adam and Miguel founded the company, and then one day the narrative changed, and it was Adam, Rebecca, and Miguel founded the company. Right. She was inserted as a co-founder years into the company, which I think is kind of the beginning of the end.
Yeah. And you note at the end of the film that Adam and Rebecca, that obviously you reached out to them, asked if they would participate, but they declined to participate in the film. And how does that create a challenge where you're telling this story, which really centralizes around Adam, but obviously you don't have any interviews with him, and you're really looking at him as a character within the film that's so central, but through the lens of other people and the stories that they tell about him. So how does that create a really interesting challenge in presenting him within the film?
From the moment that we started, and Ross and I and our colleagues sat down and figured out how we were going to make this, it was quite clear to us that it was very unlikely that we would get Adam. He was embroiled in a bunch of litigation. It just seemed, it was unlikely. So when I envisioned this telling the story, I always envisioned telling it without Adam, but I knew that WeWork had taped everything. They had a lot of great archive. Adam himself was in thousands of hours of tape. And I think that you can really learn a lot about people if you put that all together. And in the case of WeWork, because a lot of it was put into the social media sphere, you almost get to tell the story of WeWork in this way that's very true to it, which is this kind of quilt, this mosaic of all these little stories coming together, with Adam at the center of many of them. And I think through that process, I can't get inside his head, and I can't tell you what he would have said to us if he had spoken with us. And we tried, quite strenuously to get him in it. But I do think you can get a lot from looking at all of this different material together and kind of weaving it together. You can learn a lot about someone and get below the surface. And I think we were, between talking to people who knew him and seeing all this footage, I think we were able to really get to know him in a strange way, even though we didn't actually get to speak with him.
And we did have, hours and hours of discussions about approaching him, how to approach him. We were in contact with people that had direct contact with him. So, he had every opportunity to take part.
And with the amount of footage that they were filming that you had access to, it's not just that you had available to you. He was on television shows, he was on panels that were being taped. So there's such a huge amount of footage of him speaking in different ways. So what was the process of really going through all of those different types of footage and then finding the pieces that really spoke to the narrative arc that was being created from the stories other people were telling, and also thinking about the contextualization of where in the film it sits? Because, him talking about, well, we'll go public when we're ready to go public, reads in a very specific way when you place it in the film later on than it would have an hour before.
Yeah. To the first part about process, we started this film a year ago. Ross and I have only physically met each other one time. He came here for lunch. Ross is in Los Angeles. I'm in New York. He came out here for a business trip. We had a nice lunch. I think a day or two later, the pandemic shut the world down.
The next day I got COVID from someone I had breakfast with. So
fortunate that I had lunch with you.
Fortunately, yeah. So I brought COVID to LA,
we decided that we were going to press on and make the film, and we decided that one of the things we had to do was flip the normal process of the normal production process. And so because we couldn't shoot for at least a few months, we knew that that was very difficult. So we did all of the archival work first. So we were able to sort of lay out the structure of the story based on what we were able to look at and find archivally. So by the time we started filming it all and started editing it all, we already had a really good sense of how the story would play out in these archival bits and what you could actually see and what you could actually sort of touch in terms of the presence of Adam and everybody else. So I think in a strange way, COVID forced us to examine and construct the film through the prism of whatever archive was available, as opposed to what would have been a more normal process and doing it the other way around.
Yeah. And look, it's one of the quickest turnarounds we've had, and the film's great, but I mean, we locked the final card on Monday. I mean, there's still things happening in the story. So, just 3 days ago, we locked and had a lot of back and forth because there was a settlement that was announced last week between Adam and SoftBank. So it's an ever evolving story, and that was another sort of thing that we had to kind of keep doing is stay on target, but also making sure we're as current can be.
Yeah. And it's really striking when you look at a lot of the later elements of the conversations with people who worked at the company, with the guy who lived at We Live, and the emotional impact and toll that the fallout has taken, because, it's probably the same for you making this film. This isn't something where you came to work at 9, you left at 5 and you left it. You've been thinking about this, and this has been part of your fabric for a year. And that was very similar for a lot of these employees because of how they were bought into the company and that sense of community that Adam created. And his former assistant even talks about the fact that she's had therapy to try and deal with the fact that she has trust issues now because of everything that she believed to be true that then was pulled out from underneath her. What was the point in the conversations with them where you started to realize the real lasting emotional impact that the fallout of this company has had on these individuals?
I mean, Megan was the first person that I spoke to, the first of the interviewees that I spoke to, and her story really struck me and the others on the team because the experience had been so meaningful for her, and it really helped us orient the film around the notion that even though the sort of financial arc of Adam starting this crazy idea and bidding it up to $47 billion and collapsing, which is, a kind of crazy story to follow and a good story to follow. What made it more meaningful to me is that the people he took along for this ride had real, deep, meaningful, life transformative experiences. And I think it tempered the way we told the story because we wanted to do justice to the real, highs and real lows of their experiences, the real meaning that they experienced as they went on this, Icarus-like ride. And so it kind of shaped, I would say pretty early on, kind of shaped the way that we saw the story to be more, to be more thoughtful about it.
Well, congratulations on everything with the movie and having the film picked up by Hulu, premiering at South by, and I hope that the two of you get to meet a second time at some point soon.
It's so crazy.
We will.
It's so crazy.
Thank you so much for taking time to chat with us all about the film.
Thanks. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.